What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as tools for personal and community growth.
This week, we're reading Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, a Gothic horror novel set in 1950s Mexico, in which a young woman travels to visit her cousin who has just married into a creepy English colonizer family in a decaying house that may or may not be poisoning everyone's minds. Or worse. Dun dun dun! There's a huge mystery element to this book, so obviously there will be major spoilers in this episode. Please be warned, and then we can all have fun.
So, Julia, this book was interesting because I feel like it was one of the not the first time, but one of the few times on this podcast that we both just sat down, looked at each other, and been like, what about this book that neither of us have read? And then we absolutely loved it and had a lot of interesting things that I'm excited to talk about. So what was your experience while you were reading it?
That is kind of, this is new territory for us, branching outside the bookshelf. I got this book from the library, which is very unlike me, for sort of two reasons. I'm not really a horror person. And so I didn't want to commit to something that I wasn't going to want to keep. And then also, I needed to finish the book in like 2 weeks before I left for Belgium. And so if I got it from the library, it like kind of put a clock on it. Like I couldn't take it with me. You know what I mean? So I was like, well, I have to return this library book before I leave, so I have to finish it before I leave. So I took this book with me when I went to stay with my friend in LA, and we had a lovely little beach day with a little picnic, and because it's us, we brought books. And I read this entire book that day. I read like the majority of it sitting on the actual beach, and then the last little bit when we got home that night. And I got very sunburned because I apparently suck at putting on sunscreen. There were like little handprints and fingerprints on like my shoulders and my feet. Yeah. So anyway, I think it was a great beach read, first of all, because, you know, it's exciting, it's thrilling, but it's not super like difficult to understand, and it's fast-paced. But I think also I had zero expectations, right? This was a book that neither of us had read. Neither of us really knew anything about, except like the title kind of tells you something of what it's going to be like. It's a Gothic novel set in Mexico. So everything was like a pleasant surprise. Everything was kind of, twists and turns I didn't expect, and layers of critique of like colonialism and patriarchy and stuff, which we'll get to later, that I was like, ooh, this is fun. We've got a little post-colonial angle. I love this for her. Yeah, it was fun kind of getting a new feminist Gothic take. How about you?
So similarly, I read this book pretty quickly. I had started it, my normal bedtime reading of like a chapter or two, but then I went to Colorado to Estes Park, which is in the Rocky Mountains, and I was not staying at the Stanley Hotel, but I ate dinner there and went on a little ghost tour. That is the hotel that inspired Stephen King to write The Shining. So there, it's like super spooky, and like tons of people go there at this time of year. So needless to say, when I got back to the hotel I was staying at that night, it was like, oh, maybe I don't want to read this tonight. But I did read a few chapters. And then the next night, I think I had like 100 pages left, and I stayed up way too late and just like cranked through. Like, it's definitely one of those books you hit a certain point and you're like, well, I can't stop now. I couldn't pull myself away. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, so I literally know nothing about this author, so I'm very curious to hear what you found.
Silvia Moreno-Garcia is an author who, as she writes, is Mexican by birth and Canadian by inclination. She's the author of a number of critically acclaimed novels, including, of course, Mexican Gothic, but also Gods of Jade and Shadow. She also just released the book Velvet Was the Night, which is also getting a lot of attention right now. She has an MA in Science and Technology Studies from the University of British Columbia. I thought her thesis was pretty fascinating. It's called Magna Mater, Women and Eugenic Thought in the Work of H.P. Lovecraft. So I thought it was interesting, the time that she spent in the world of like science as well as literature kind of combining. She currently lives in Vancouver. There's an interview with Silvia in a anthology called Friction, which, full disclaimer, I received a copy because my mentor is the editor of the anthology. But I found the interview particularly interesting because Silvia's background was she needed to write to feed her kids. Like, the writing was her craft, and she would sell stories on the side just to make like a few extra bucks here and there. And that kind of like launched her into the space over time. So she has a long career. She's been writing for a long time, lots of publications, short stories, anthologies. She puts together a magazine, a horror magazine called The Dark, for a few years. She's a columnist for the Washington Post, as well as she spoke about in this interview how, like, if you're in the literary world, eventually you start publishing things because you want to with your friends and you know people, so you just do it. So she is a publisher of Innsmouth Free Press. So anyways, I found her story interesting as far as someone who didn't come up in a lot of the traditional paths. She talked about how she kind of felt self-conscious for a while that she didn't have an MFA, that she hadn't gone that path, but kind of came to terms with like, well, I wrote myself into it, you know, like I still was able to write the stories I wanted to tell. So even though I didn't go get that specific degree that can unlock a lot of doors for people, she was able to find different avenues to where she's at now. And now Mexican Gothic has recently been optioned by Hulu for a show. So we'll see if that, when and if that comes out someday, that'd be pretty cool. I think this would make for a wonderful movie or even maybe a short TV series.
I really had to restrain myself from just like writing the entire plot. And this is already pretty long. So this is like the setup for the book. And then we'll get into more as we go. So we follow a young woman named Noemi, who is very intelligent and beautiful and very rich, but who seems at first to be very, like, flighty and avoiding responsibility and just doesn't want to let anyone get close to her. She's on her, like, third career direction where she wants to go back to university, so she changes her mind a lot. And then her father gets a mysterious letter from Noemi's cousin, who recently married into this English family that's kind of, like, dying out. They're, like, the remnants of like a colonizer family that ran a silver mine for many years before it shut down. And so this letter, her cousin sounds kind of like she's losing it, and it's very disturbing, and it seems like she thinks that her new family is like trying to kill her or something. Like, it doesn't sound good. But she keeps asking for Noemi, and so she's sent to investigate and possibly help get her cousin to like a mental hospital or something. However, when Noemi gets there, the family is super creepy and manipulative and controlling, and Noemi starts hearing voices and having nightmares, and it's like, shit is going down in this house. So with the help of the youngest member of the family, a young man named Francis, and a local doctor and healer from the nearby town, Noemi has to like unravel what exactly is happening in this house. And there's some crazy things. There's some incest. There's some mind-controlling mushrooms. There's a man trying to achieve immortality off the suffering of his family. Some light arson. It's a good time. It's a bit of a wild ride once you get into it.
Just a quick content warning. One thing I did not know going into this book that I wish I did is that there is some pretty intense sexual assault that happens, as well as some like implied coercion sexually. So just be aware if that's something that you are not interested in reading, maybe skip out this book or find like a spoiler sheet that can like let you know what sections to skip over. This podcast is made possible by our wonderful book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. So Julie and I are readers. We like to talk about books, but we're also writers. And so with our book club members, we love to share newsletters of things happening in our personal lives, as well as essays, poetry, other things we're writing. So, starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive newsletters, poems, etc. that we write, and get early and discounted access to future events. If you want to take your support to the next level, you can also join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community, a possible neurodiverse person looking for resources, or an ally hoping to learn from an actually autistic person? Members of this tier get access free to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. You can follow the link in our show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. Now back to the books.
I don't know how to get into this.
Well, we'll have a little music intro, we'll have a little ad spot, and then we'll come back. So, this is a Gothic novel. If you didn't get it from the title, the genre is Gothic. Though I would argue it's probably like a blend of genres. There's a lot of interesting things happening. And in that interview I mentioned in Friction, Silvia Moreno-Garcia kind of like pushes back against the idea of like trying to be like one genre. So she kind of names it as like an Anglo-Saxon approach towards literature of like trying to like box something in, where she's like, I enjoy a lot of things, and so there's going to be some mystery, some horror, some almost like sci-fi elements, magical realism, kind of like all tied together. Like we don't need to pin it down on one thing. Though the fact that she named it Mexican Gothic is a huge genre influence. If you are not familiar with Gothic literature, we did a whole deep dive on the elements of Gothic lit back in our Jane Eyre episode last season. So you can check out that episode if you want more like in-depth analysis of what kind of constitutes a Gothic novel. But yeah, you pointed out, Julia, in our prep that in that episode of Jane Eyre, we kind of complained that it doesn't always adapt well to modern day. But I think this story does a really good job of using those elements, but also incorporating some more modern elements, kind of twisting some parts of the genre that maybe wouldn't work as well for the modern reader.
Nothing about it feels forced. Like it feels very like, oh yes, this was the right genre. This was the right form to tell this story, and yeah, it feels very organic. Though she's very blatant in like, I mean, obviously there's the word Gothic in the title, and she references Gothic literature directly a lot.
Which is one of my favorite as in most ridiculous elements of the genre, is like if you name books by other Gothic writers in your book, that is an element of Gothic literature. It's like, wait, what? You just like name drop like Wuthering Heights, and it's like, maybe this is a Gothic novel.
That's all it takes. Yeah, so Naomi, as she's getting to know this weird, creepy house, she thinks about Gothic literature and how much her cousin loved it growing up, and how she was like, okay, I think I can see why my cousin would want to move here, why she would find this romantic, the idea of it, because there's so many Gothic stories of like creepy old houses and mysteries, but like romance in the midst of it. So yeah, by directly referencing that, she's able to play around with it a little bit, but she acknowledges like this old house on the top of a hill surrounded by mist and graves. Yes, this is Gothic on purpose. And yeah, but then there are other, I don't know, I like the blatant references, I think, give her a lot of freedom to tweak the genre as she wants to, because it's very self-aware Gothic literature.
Yeah, I think that self-aware element is really important in a lot of aspects. I think one big one for me that we took issue with Jane Eyre is like the unlikely love story that feels like complicated at best and like unhealthy at worst in a lot of Gothic literature, because typically it's, you know, a heroine following for like this tragic hero / maybe villain ? Whereas I think in this, Naomi is so independent, and you kind of find out that the like sexualization, whatever, is like a insidious force, you know, like it's like mind control in a way, when there are these elements of like, am I attracted to this like terrible person? You realize like it's all manipulative. And then the character that she might have, you know, some friendship that could be more with, he is self-aware, like you said, that he is a part of the problem. And like he actually doesn't think he's going to be able to leave it he thinks it's almost like his dying endeavor to like help her escape, but that he's like too entrenched to ever get out. Spoiler, like we said, he gets out. Um, in the end, we like Francis.
He does get out. Yeah, and it's interesting because he kind of a parallel, but also not with Jane Eyre, like with the love interest. Jane Eyre is like obsessed with the fact that Rochester is ugly because she's like, it's your soul that I want, you know? And you kind of get a little bit of that in here too, where like Naomi is so sick of these pretty guys who don't seem to care about her as a person. And even like the guy that her cousin married, he's the oldest
Virgil.
son? Is he the oldest son of the house, or is he the grandson?
Yeah, he's the son of Virgil. Francis is the grandson, but they're like relatively close in age.
But he's kind of acting as like the head of the household in many ways. He's like this gorgeous, probably in other Gothic literature would be the one that she falls in love with. But like you said, there's like a lot of manipulative mind control kind of stuff related to him. And so she really likes that Francis, the guy that is helping her, is ugly. It feels more authentic to her, maybe? It's more refreshing. I don't know. It's really interesting that she's like really cares about that fact. Maybe because it proves that he's not trying to make her attracted to him. Anyway, but I thought that was an interesting parallel because it kind of flips the trope but also incorporates it at the same time. Should we talk about the mushrooms?
Yeah. So, okay, the incendiary force, you know, the gloom, like we're not really sure what's happening. There's like, are we hallucinating? Are these nightmares real? It seems like there's like an element that is real because when Naomi is awake, she finds out from Virgil that what she thought was a dream, he was also he was living, and like that's super creepy. Like everything's connected. What is it? And it's mushrooms. There's a fungus that is growing. I mean, we won't get into all the details. You can read the book and try to piece together exactly how it happened. But, you know, this mushroom that can heal, that the locals before the English family came used as like a healing, almost religious tool for these spiritual experiences. But the English colonizer, Harold, he comes in, he finds it, and he decides he's going to take it to the extremes so he can live forever with immortality. And so he manipulates and uses like everyone around him, everyone in his family, to literally like live forever by inhabiting other people's bodies with the help of this fungus. But it's like the spores are in the air, so everyone's breathing it in. And once you become connected to it, they call it the gloom. Once you're connected to the gloom, you can't leave. And they have other people who have tried to leave and have died or have been killed. There's been attempts at rebellion from within the family, but because Harold controls the gloom, he's like the strongest one, and others are learning to control it as well. The rebellion fails. The daughter who attempted this in the past, Ruth, has died. What looks like suicide, but you learn later was Harold manipulating her. So it's like crazy that it all comes down to a mushroom, which I think is so perfect.
Yeah.
It just works really well.
It's so smart. And it's so creepy because it like the mushrooms like are growing sort of underground, and then their mycelium are sort of all throughout like the walls of this house, and then the spores are sort of in the air, and so you're always like breathing in this fungus. So it means that the house itself is kind of alive, and I feel like in every single Gothic story, you're like, the house is a character, you know, the house has is whatever. We even talked about this with Beloved too, right? When there's kind of a haunting that's tied to a place, the building itself kind of has its own characteristics and can manipulate you and kind of comes alive, and you being there affects your mind and stuff. And so it's such a kind of fun modernization, kind of playful take on that ghost supernatural element, right? That you're taking something that's a bit more science-y, I guess. It's a bit more practical, but it's still so creepy because like mushrooms have this kind of, they like grow out of death, you know, and they're really scary, you know, because some of them are good for food. Some of them will kill you. Some of them will make you see stuff. And you just like sometimes don't know. So we have this association of them, like they grow out of decaying forests and plants and animals and stuff. And so it gives the whole house and all the people this feeling of like rotting from the inside, and kind of mysterious, and they're so creepy, and it's so smart. And I'm like, why has no one thought of this before? This is genius. Evil mushrooms. Yeah, I loved that.
Yeah, and I think the, like you were saying, the kind of, like, death and decay elements are creepy, but also the, like, we just don't know. You know, there's, like, so much we don't know about mushrooms. When we read Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma, he has a whole section where he's learning about mushrooms for, like, food purposes, and, like, how people, like, hunt and gather them, you don't hunt mushrooms. He also talked about, like, we think we know how their science works. Like, their connections might be, like, even further than we realize because they're so small and fragile that you can't, like, pull it out of the ground like a plant with roots to see how it's all connected. Yeah, it's, like, super kind of creepy, unknown, and maybe because it's the element of death and decay, or maybe it's the texture or what it is, but it has almost that, like, oh, gross factor. And unless you're, like, confident that you're seeing mushrooms in, like, a food setting, you might be like, oh, no, I don't want to touch that. Or like, oh, get them out of my yard. So, yeah, I think it really works well. And I really like specifically how Moreno-Garcia led Noemi to figure it out with the help of Francis. Noemi's father made his money, their, like, new money, the paint industry and, like, paint chemicals. And so she has this, like, working knowledge of, like, how different paint chemicals interact with each other to make different colors, and specific history of chemicals from, like, the Victorian era that led to, like, people accidentally poisoning themselves. And so it's, like, a little heavy-handed that you're like, I don't think it can be the paint because it would be too obvious if it was the paint because, like, she just happens to know a lot about paints. But that kind of mindset of, like, well, it has to be something tangible. Like, she doesn't immediately believe, like, oh, it's ghosts or it's supernatural. Like, she doesn't immediately leap to that. And so she kind of takes this first step of, like, is it in the walls? It's, like, something there. And when she kind of confronts Francis, he's like, oh, you're way closer than I thought you were. Like, you're, like, one step away from understanding what this is. And I think that was just, like, so masterfully done as far as the plot goes.
Yeah, all the jokes about Victorian era people being super sickly and, like, depressed and dramatic or whatever. Like, was it female hysteria or was everyone just dying of asbestos poisoning? Like,
right.
And then, you know, here's Noemi being like, yeah, if this is a really old house, there's probably something in the walls that's we should not be breathing. And Francis is like, holy shit, how did you get that? Yeah, it's good. There's a documentary called Fantastic Fun Guy that I have mixed feelings about, but it did teach me a lot about mushrooms. And one of the things is how mushroom mycelium, the kind of threads connecting everything, is sort of the brain of the forest. So, like, different plants and trees and stuff can send information to each other through the mycelium about, like, where there's more water or if there's fire or if there's, you know, kind of basic information, and can, like, so then they can kind of send each other resources. Fascinating. And so I was coming into this book with that conception of mushrooms as, like, a hive, like a big brain, you know, like a kind of interconnected system that operated like a brain and everything was kind of interconnected. And so it like made a ton of sense to me. And yeah, I really loved it.
So let's talk about Noemi.
Yeah.
She's a fascinating character. I didn't necessarily like her at the beginning.
Yeah.
Honestly, the first, like, quarter of the book, even maybe first, like, third of the book, was a little hard for me to, like, get through. Like, I wanted to keep reading, but I wasn't, like, rooting for anyone. I wasn't, like, super invested in anyone's lives. It really wasn't until we start figuring out more of the mystery that I was like, okay, now I care.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm intrigued. But you had some really interesting thoughts as we were preparing for this of, like, why this really works.
Yeah, it made me kind of excited because I was like, we're introduced to Noemi and I was like, this is fascinating. She's kind of unlikable. She's really stubborn and distrustful of men, and she kind of refuses to like settle on a career path, and she won't let anyone get close to her, and she seems like she doesn't care about anything. That's kind of the air that she gives off, and you're just like, who is this woman, and why am I like, she's the main character, really? Okay. And then she gets to this house, and you slowly start to realize, like, oh, the qualities that make her quote unquote unlikable as a woman are like the most important traits in bringing down these kind of this house, right? These ancient and evil power systems that rely on mind control, right? Like, she needs to be stubborn, and she needs to be an independent thinker, and she needs to not trust men, and she needs to be kind of unwilling to just accept the story that she's been told, and she needs to know a lot about a lot of different subjects and maybe not pick one yet, and these are the things that save her life, help her bring everything down. And I ended up really, really liking that, because it made me realize how, like, a woman being quote unquote unlikable was like a political stance, right? It was a kind of refusal to not be trapped. She keeps men at a distance because that helps her not be trapped into a marriage in which she would lose all of her agency and her money and whatever. And refusing to pick a certain path has allowed her a lot more social flexibility, because it's given her time to just like find what she cares about. And, she keeps her stubbornness all the way through, even like she just blatantly disobeys rules while she's in the house that her cousin or Francis wouldn't dare disobey. But she's like, no, my cousin's life is more important than following your rules. And I really liked that kind of messaging. Part of fighting against the way that society tries to control women, one way you have of doing that is to just be unlikable, or vice versa. If you do rebel in any way, you're going to be labeled as unlikable, and that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or you're a bad person or something.
Yeah. I really like that you point out her, like, breadth of knowledge. I think even Noemi is, like, a little ashamed of her constant changing academic interest, or at least she's, like, socialized or feels pressured to, like, pick something and be good at it. But in this case, it really becomes a strength. So I think often in novels, we will get really intelligent characters who just happen to know a lot about something, or a sidekick that just, like, happens to be really into that one subject that's going to save everyone. Or they spend a chunk of the book learning and, like, reading a ton. She keeps seeing all these, like, libraries, or like there is a library in the house and it's referenced a few times. She spends some time in there. I'm always expecting her to, like, go and read, and then she's going to discover it through reading what the secret is. But not really. There's, like, one letter that becomes, like, important, but otherwise she doesn't really do much reading. And it's all, like, her realistic knowledge of a bunch of different things that she's gathered through her life experiences, plus her personality, like you mentioned, of being stubborn and independent and fiercely loyal to her cousin, that, like, helps save the day. Like, she knows a little bit about paint chemicals. She knows a lot about anthropology and history. She's bilingual. Like, that's what ends up saving her and helping her, like, tear down this, like, evil power system.
It made me think of the expression good trouble. Her being quote unquote trouble, right? Her not conforming, her being frustrating to the people who only care about controlling everything around them is good. And I feel like there's a major theme in this book of, like, the importance of women, particularly women of color, making good trouble and taking back spaces and refusing to follow the rules. And that's always fun, I like that in a book.
I also think she's a very realistic character in a book that's full of maybe perhaps some unrealistic settings and plot and characters and whatnot. She has some very, like, lifelike qualities that I think make me eventually, like, oh yeah, she's an awesome character. Even if initially I'm like, she's, like, a young socialite who doesn't really care about anything. Like, why is she being trusted with this mission of, like, helping her cousin when, like, she doesn't really seem to be that great at anything or that interested in anything but herself and like looking nice. And she even struggles that with like a few times of like wishing she was elsewhere, or when she decides she's going to leave, when she's just like, I don't have what the tools or the power to make change here. I'm going to leave. And turns out she can't. And then that's when she kind of like doubles down and she doesn't give up and finds a comrade in arms to like help break out of the situation. So I think that was particularly great too, that she doesn't become this like perfect model of family loyalty. She has some serious doubts and questions, but she ultimately is seeking to save her cousin and figures out a way to do that.
So we've been talking about this system, this house. Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
There's some pretty obvious symbolism here that's, I think, quite literal about, like, imperialism and patriarchy, right? Of, like, the family is literally a British colonizer family. Like, literally, you know? Like, there's not...
Yeah, there's no, like, metaphor. It's like, that's exactly what they did.
That's exactly what they did. Yeah, so you don't have to go far to, like, find that symbolism in the house and whatever. But I feel like it was complex enough that it was interesting to me.
Yeah, there's like this phrase that keeps coming back, open your eyes, that Ruth, the daughter who previously tried rebelling and lost her life because of it, there's part of her still in the gloom, and so she's talking, Noemi learns how to like talk with her, and this phrase that ends up kind of saving Noemi time and again is open your eyes. Like, realize that this isn't real, or recognize that this is part of something bigger, or break out of this moment, like take a step back. So it's quite literal to the characters when they like wake up from this nightmare, but also very symbolic in this larger conversation. Like, if we don't open our eyes as individuals and as a collective, we just continue to accept the system around us as inherent and immovable, instead of recognizing that these are power structures at play that doesn't have the health and well-being of all people as their main interests, and that we need to open our eyes to the systems that exist of patriarchy, racism, lingering imperialism and colonialism if we're going to like make change.
Yeah, that's also a good phrase too, because the part of the metaphor with the mushrooms and the spores in the house is that you can't see it exactly. It's like in the air, you're breathing it in, you're drinking it in the wine, right? It's like you're swimming in it, but you can see the effects of it if you open your eyes to it. You can see that these people kind of live forever and nothing is ever wrong with them. You can see the effects that it has on their brains and the way that they talk, and you can see the control and the stifling nature that it has, and you can see how it, like, the effect that it had on local populations as well. Like, you can see it, and you can see the poverty in the nearby town now that the main industry is gone. But you can't see the spores themselves until you like get to the root, you know, the mother mushroom. You can't until you get underground and really look for it. You can't see it. Oh, also the way with the spores, the sort of eternal life juice is essentially used to like grow and preserve new bodies in this certain bloodline, so that the patriarch of the family, when the body that he's in dies, he can pass his consciousness to the next body. And so it has this very patrilineal, like, it's literally being passed down, and it's like in their blood as well. And so it's not something like, even Francis, who's like actively trying to fight against it, when they get out, he's like, I don't know what's going to happen to me if I'm out of that system, because it's still in me. You know what I mean? It's still in my brain. Yeah. It's still in my blood. Like, I don't know if I'm going to survive without it. And it's harder to root out than just leaving. Like, the children, the siblings try to leave, and they always come back. It's really, really hard to kill.
Yeah, it's really this, like, infection of this patriarchy mindset and of this, like, superiority, imperialism point of view. And I think this symbolism kind of works too with patriarchy, of like having a hard time distinguishing what I want as an individual versus like what does the system want me to want.
Right.
Which you see like very explicit in the book when Noemi realizes like, oh, someone's like messing with my mind, making me want things I don't want, or like physically moving me that I don't have a choice. But she even gets like lost in like, do I have feelings for Virgil? Like, do I have this lust? Is that real? And that's just like one example of how this like patriarchy kind of, the system or whatever, the gloom infects everyone to the point that they don't really know themselves. And I think Frances kind of struggles with that too. Like, who will I be outside of this? I don't know. I've never been outside of it. So let's talk about the women.
Yes. Yeah. So one of my favorite things about the story is that Noemi is not the first woman to try to take down this system. Victoria mentioned Ruth earlier, one of the daughters. She fell in love with like a local boy and wanted to like run away with him, but he was killed, right?
He like, it's unknown. He disappears.
He disappears. Okay.
Presumed dead.
Yeah. And so Ruth literally just takes a shotgun and just starts killing the men in her family, and then takes a shot at Harold and severely wounds him, then aims it at her own head as well. And so she isn't able to fully take down the system at that time, but she weakens it. She weakens it enough that they're like desperate to bring in some new blood, quote unquote. It also means that the house is a lot weaker, and Harold is a lot weaker, and so the whole system is kind of crumbling, and they're really desperate. And so then when Noemi comes in, she is sort of more properly set up to there's enough weaknesses in the system that she and Frances can quite literally burn it down. They burn the house down and the mushrooms, and they burn the whole thing. But yeah, I love that it's like two generations of women who work in tandem, and Ruth like through the gloom talks directly to Noemi and like is helping her out to sort of help show her how to take him down once and for all. And I really loved that kind of symbolism. Like, it's not just one woman.
It's the inside the system, outside the system, like taking it down from everywhere.
Yeah.
I also really liked how the local language and culture is an important piece of what saved them. So Noemi speaks Spanish, and Frances has learned Spanish as well, but Harold doesn't speak Spanish. So they can speak Spanish so he can't hear them through the gloom, because otherwise, basically, Harold can hear everything that happens in the house. As well as, like, the local medicine healer. She creates, like, a tincture that, like, helps break the bond between the individual and the gloom to kind of weaken their ties to the system around them so that they can escape and literally burn it down behind them. So I found that like a really important facet of this like symbolism too, just highlighting the importance of the language and culture of those who've been oppressed and like as vital information and tools of tearing down oppressive systems.
Yeah, because Harold, the patriarch, the one who's trying to control everything, because he discredits it as not being valid or real or important or worthy of his time or whatever, that becomes a weak spot for him, something that he doesn't know. And yeah, they're able to use that.
Just now as we're talking, I was thinking back to Silvia Moreno-Garcia's master's thesis and how she talked about like eugenics and tied it to literature. And that becomes an important piece of this book as well, is that Harold is like, like Noemi finds out very quickly, like, oh, he's very racist and like has these terrible, terrible like eugenic ideas of like the superior bloodlines and races versus like inferior local cultures in Mexico.
She figures out, because she knows her stuff about like eugenics was very tied to anthropology for a long time, and since she's got a familiarity with that subject, she like knows the things that he's probably read and believes and is able to kind of fight back, and she's able to kind of suss out like he only values the local population for their having like a strength or vitality that English people don't have, and he really only values them as like bodies or vessels, right? And you slowly learn over time, like, oh, he thinks that the bodies of her and her cousin are like, he thinks that they're better fit to like carry the spores, and again is able to use that against him.
So ultimately at the end of the book, you can piece together, as Noemi learns, like the initial body that was used to kind of like build this fungal system was the body of a woman, Agnes, who was Harold's sister, who was tortured and buried alive, and like her death and her life force then is like what sustains the system. And like they kind of creepily refer to her as a mother, even though Noemi's like, wait, she didn't have any kids. Like it's interesting too, because I feel like sometimes when you're like, oh, like this mother life force, it can be like a nurturing idea or perhaps like a very powerful female idea, but when you or like feminist idea, but when you realize that Agnes was like against her will, she was kind of like her body was sacrificed to the patriarchal let's live forever system that was they were trying to build. So that was like, I think one detail that will probably like haunt me for a long time.
Yeah.
Is that through the whole novel, Noemi hears this like buzzing that sounds like bees or something, and she realizes at the end it's the years and years and years of the screams and cries of the women who were killed to like create the system.
Ooh.
And it's just like, oh
yeah.
like knife in the heart. And you like also realize like, oh, that's reality, you know, like it's the on the backs of women, specifically women of color, that have been tortured and oppressed, that we have our systems of power.
Yeah, dude, the image of the mushroom growing out of her face, horrifying, haunted me in my dreams. It was like, I did not want that image in my head. Yeah, very, very effective. It's kind of like the final reveal, the final kind of drop. Oof. So Noemi sets her free by letting her finally die. It's good stuff. It's very, very good stuff. Yeah. We love a genre book that also gives us all this like complex analytical juice.
Yeah, like social commentary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So for people who enjoyed reading this book and are interested in related books to read, movies to watch, whatever, other media, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I couldn't think of any books. But I don't really read much in this genre, which I think we talked about last time when we did Jane Eyre. But it made me think of two films. One is, I mentioned earlier, it's a documentary called Fantastic Fungi, just to learn more about mushrooms if you were intrigued by the mushroom part of this story. It's a little like people who follow mushrooms get very, very spiritual about it, and there's certain parts of it that felt like kind of a conversion documentary, like they're trying to convert you to a religion, not just trying to teach you about mushrooms. And so it made me a little uncomfortable in certain parts, but I also learned a lot. So like, I'll recommend it with that caveat that like, you might feel a bit manipulated by the music or whatever.
Yeah, with every head bowed and hand raised, who commits their life to our Lord and Savior, the mushroom.
That's what it felt like. But like learning about foraging and how mushrooms work, and it's really fascinating stuff. They are really cool. And then for the gothic horror element, I've been talking for weeks about Halsey's album, If I Can't Have Love, I Want Power. And there's also a corresponding film that was originally released in IMAX that will be on HBO for a few months. And it's not just like a music video film, you know, it's like a proper movie with a plot. It's again like kind of a modern feminist take on kind of gothic horror that it looks really cool. So yeah, I would recommend that as well.
So I already mentioned the literary anthology Friction. The specific edition is volume 18, Legacy, where there's the interview with Silvia Moreno-Garcia, as well as the first chapter of her new book, Velvet Was the Night. That book sounds super interesting, too. It's a historical fiction mystery thriller set in the 1970s during a time of political unrest in Mexico City. Moreno-Garcia talks about how she was influenced by Lovecraft. So I've never read anything by H.P. Lovecraft, and I feel like maybe I should.
War of the Worlds? No?
Oh, I did listen to that. Like, do you remember when, what was that? Wasn't that the one where they like played it on the radio and everyone thought it was real? And it was like the first audiobook that deceived the world.
Yeah. Well, because at the very beginning they said it was fictional, but like if people joined
Yeah.
late, they thought that it was a live broadcast about an alien invasion. It's good stuff.
Yes. I remember listening to that in school. That was really fun. Okay, so besides War of the Worlds, I have not read anything by him. There's a podcast called Voyage into Genre that LitHub produces. They have an episode where they interview Silvia Moreno-Garcia, which I actually haven't gotten to her interview first because it's like a two-parter, and I was like, oh, I'll skip past this first author and listen to Moreno-Garcia and prep for this podcast, but I like kept it playing, and I was like, wait, this sounds really cool too. So In the Watchful City is a novella by S. Chu-Yi Liu, which is like steampunk meets sci-fi meets thriller. I don't know. It sounded very fascinating. And so I want to go read it now. And I also am very curious how the two stories kind of like speak to each other. That like, I love when like, it's what I loved about college when they were like, here's all these books and we're going to put them on a syllabus and like, let's look how they speak to each other. Yeah. Pinning two authors in a podcast episode together. I thought was interesting. And then we mention it like every time we read horror because Julie and I have like a limited list of horror that we've actually read. But Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado is a short story collection with some spooky elements.
Mm-hmm. All right. Here it comes.
Here it comes.
Currently obsessed. What is bringing you joy, Victoria?
So, a few things. I've been writing a few letters to friends. Usually I read before bed, but the last 2 nights I've been like writing a letter because I've been literally carrying a stack of note cards and been like, oh, that was so-and-so's birthday. Oh, so-and-so, like, I should reach out to them. And I'd be just carrying around empty note cards and not using them. So I'm like, okay, I'm condensing my possessions to travel for a while. I'm not allowed to take stationery with me if I do not use it. But it's been nice. So some good old-fashioned letter writing I've been really enjoying. We bought a bottle of Koval's single barrel bourbon whiskey. My partner came back from the store and he's like, I splurged. And I'm like, oh, like, did you buy like a second pint of ice cream instead of just one? He's like, no. And he pulls out like a $60 bottle of bourbon. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's a splurge. Holy cow. But it's really delicious. We've been sipping on a little bit here and there. If you're not familiar with Koval, it's a distillery from Chicago, and I have extreme brand loyalty because I really like them. I don't think I've ever mentioned on here, but if you're listening and you are a podcaster yourself, and you're not already aware, podnews.net they have an email newsletter that is really awesome. Like when anyone asks me like, how did you find about that job or fellowship you applied for? How did you find out about that like stuff in the podcasting industry? Like literally Pod News is like all I read because it just like aggregates like all the top news out there in the podcasting space. That was on my mind today, and I was like, I don't think I've ever talked about that on the podcast. And then lastly, yes, I'm still talking about it, thestorygraph.com is a really great place to track your reading, keep a list of books you want to read. I have the app on my phone, so whenever someone is like, oh, have you read this book? And I haven't, I immediately go search for it, add it to my to-read pile. And it's so much easier than writing it on sticky notes everywhere or just being like, oh yeah, I'll remember that. Especially as Julie and I sit down about every 3 to 4 months and we say, what 10 books do we want to read? And I look at her with a blank stare because I have no books left on my shelf considering I'm traveling now in with extremely limited storage space. So it's a good way to keep track of things. And if you are into reading challenges, you can find the Book Club with Julie and Victoria reading challenge where you can track along all the books that you've read with us. And you can find me, Victoria from Book Club. And I'd love to follow you back and see what you're reading because that's literally the best thing ever is just friends and books, which is why we have this podcast.
You probably could have guessed that I was going to plug this. The show that is sweeping not only the nation, but the globe. The one and only Squid Game. It's a new K-drama that's like an allegorical critique of late-stage capitalism and the toll that it takes on people's bodies, and pretty creepy. It's not a perfect show. Like, I don't know. I think some people have mixed feelings about it. Some people are obsessed with it. And it's also very violent. Like, lots of people get murdered. So, like, major trigger warnings there in that area. So basically, you play a children's game, and the consequence of losing is you die. That's the premise of the show.
Interesting. Okay, so, sorry, side note, now we're just on welcome to the Squid Game podcast. So, I saw Squid Game, like, listed on, like, Netflix or something, wherever it's being shown. I was like, oh, it's a thing you can watch. And I saw people posting about it, like, oh my gosh, Squid Game, have you watched it? But, like, no one was saying what it was about. And so I asked someone, and they started with, it's a game show. And then they continued to talk about it. And I was like, I'm missing something important here. And then when they said people die, I'm like, this isn't real. This is not an actual game show. It's a show about a game show. I think Julie did a great job by, starting off saying it's a drama. So if you, just heard game show and red light, green light, and that was the first you tuned in to this podcast because maybe you were, like, washing dishes or, like, taking your dog out and, like, a little distracted.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's fictional, which took me a solid 3 minutes of horror listening to someone describe this show to realize. But happy October, I just got, like, terrified that we were at the stage of actually watching people, like, get murdered on television as a game.
Oh my god. Yeah, anyway. So there's a lot of, like, really incredible social commentary and good writing and good characters. And, like, the aesthetics are great. Just, yeah. But it's dark, as we've established. On a lighter note, I've also been very obsessed with this EP called Bad Love by the artist Key. It's so good. It's, like, David Bowie inspired in terms of the visual aesthetic and the sound. And I've been listening to it all week. It's so good. That'll make you feel better after you watch Squid Game.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at BookClubWithJV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support, our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.